Zero, Kotaku reported just today and right before we did the podcast that loot boxes could be regulated to be adults only if a bill passes in Australia. An independent Australian lawmaker has put a bill into I think Parliament. I'm
Yeah.
not okay in Parliament that would essentially take loot box and loot box mechanics, which could also mean packs of cards and stuff like that, would have to be regulated as adults only if it's in video games. And adults only is basically 18 plus, and that kids cannot buy it or play it at any point in time.
The formal rating in Australia for games that are 18 plus is R18 plus.
Right. And ours
And
is AO, essentially. This will also lead to a lot of console makers having the question of whether they're going to want to have AO games on their console, which for years now has been a flat no. They don't want it. So Zero, what are your thoughts of this Australian lawmaker trying to get a bill passed to make loot boxes regulated to be adults only?
it's a bit interesting because this Australian politician, Andrew Wilkie, is following the same example that we've seen in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, where in those two countries, they just flat out outlawed loot boxes, period. So this is a bit of a step below that, so not quite as extreme, but it does bring up the interesting question on just restricting games with loot box or loot box like mechanics to be only purchasable for people above the ages of 18, because 18 is the legal gambling age in Australia for anyone not familiar with Australian law and policy. What makes this interesting is, will this end up making games that have loot box mechanics, such as the NBA 2K series by 2K Games? That's easily one that could be under the crosshairs of this potential law if it does even pass in the Australian Parliament. Because if it passes, a game like NBA 2K would also have to have a screen right before it boots up to the title warning in a pretty large font saying this game does have microtransactions. So even if a person chooses to buy it, they will have to suffer through the fact that there will be nag screens right before you get to the title screen. So that's another requirement, Mr. Wilkie's policy that has been introduced into Parliament. So, and much like you said, in the US, typically an AO rating is a death sentence for a retail game. Just no console makers want to have a game that is rated AO on their consoles because they want their consoles to be seen as a product that's enjoyable for the entire family, and to have a game that has a giant AO mark on it doesn't really look good on the retail space. And I imagine it still doesn't look good on the digital storefronts either. So I would imagine just if the R18 plus rating in Australia has the same sort of weight as the AO rating that we have from the ESRB in the US, this could end up potentially making games very unattractive for stores in Australia to stock on their shelves. But honestly, that would be something someone from Australia would have to comment on and fill us in on, because we don't know how the gaming stores are compared to what we see over here in the US and everything. I think what makes this whole bill interesting is that potentially, depending on certain situations for games with loot boxes, this bill would also provide lawmakers the ability to put a RC label on these games. And for anyone who does not know what the RC label is, that is a straight out ban in the Australian rating system, RC being short for refused classification. So basically a game that is considered to be just non-compliant with Australian law, that they will just outright ban the game, and the game will not be legally purchasable within the confines of Australia.
I don't think this would work in the US, only because I'm thinking about it now, and there's one thing that would stop this from happening, and that's baseball cards and trading cards. I could see a person that works for the ESA turn around and go, what about Magic cards, Pokemon cards, baseball cards? Are they illegal now? Are they only for 18 years old? People who are 18 years old? Is that what we're doing now here? The other thing I read up on this too is that this was from an independent politician, not from any of the parties like Labor, and I think there's a Conservative Party as well for Australia. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if it's the Australian Labor Party and the Liberal Party that I think has the most people on there. If it was one of those parties, I would be more reliant on thinking that this might go through. But since this is an independent, something tells me this is going to go nowhere. I don't think this is going to go anywhere at all. I think what will happen basically is this will gain press for about a week, and then this bill will quietly die. Unless independents have a little more power, a little more sway than they do in, like, let's say, the English or the U.S. political system, because independence in our system has no pull really at all, except for Bernie Sanders. The only reason why Bernie Sanders has any pull is because he regularly works with the Democrats. I don't see this moving forward at all. I think it dies. And maybe not quickly, but quietly. I think this will die. We'll never hear from it again. What do you think?
I can't say that I'm an expert on Australian politics either. It'll be really interesting to see if this gains any traction or not, especially since it sounds like this guy isn't allied with any of the bigger political parties in Australia. So if no one decides to ally themselves to this bill that he's introduced, then yeah, expect this bill to kind of end up being shuffled quietly out of existence. And that'll be the last that we hear of it. But if the moral panic play that this particular politician is going with, or restricting games with loot box like microtransactions, ends up picking up moral steam with the Australian government, and you have people just jumping to ally themselves with the bill, who knows? That could completely change the dynamics.
Yeah, I'm not a politics expert of Australia either. I'm barely one for the United States, so I'm not going to pretend I am. But you would need one of a couple things for this to work. You need a politician who's popular, and I don't know if this Wilkie guy is. You're going to have an issue that relates to the public, which, I hate to say it, but I don't think the mass public cares that much about this. I don't think they're even aware that this is going on, for the most part. Even though gaming is popular, I don't think a lot of people are aware of this type of thing that's going on in gaming. And there has to be a moral panic in order for it to really, build momentum. And I just don't see that happening. The only time I see a moral panic really happening is when it deals with something taboo, or when someone dies. I'm thinking about the moral panic with the video nasties in the 60s and 70s in England and in the US, with movies like Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, A Clockwork Orange, stuff like that. Things that genuinely, how do I put this? That genuinely offended people. You would have to offend people in order for it to gain a moral panic. I don't see this working. Unless he has more pull than I realize, I think the bill dies. Thank you for listening to this podcast segment. The Capital Games podcast is done every week, and we post it on all your favorite podcast apps, as well as segments on YouTube. If you want to listen to another segment, you can listen to a new one right there on the screen. We also do a movie podcast called the Capital Games Movie Club. If you'd like, you can go ahead and click on that and see all the movies that we have reviewed from that point. Thank you for listening, and we hope to hear from you soon.